He pled guilty, Sal, okay?
Welcome to Culture Screen, where we analyze culture. In this episode, we're summarizing the 10th episode from Season 6 of the Sopranos series titled Mo and Joe. The episode first aired on May 14th, 2006. In the beginning, Tony walks down his driveway to pick up his newspaper as he usually does. As he bends down to pick up the paper, Johnny Sack's landscaper, Vito, asks Tony if he needs to continue working on Johnny's home even though he isn't around to pay him anymore. Tony gets upset at him and tells him that he should be ashamed of himself for being so selfish. Here we see that Sal is actually looking to see if Tony will pay him for continuing to do the work essentially for free. Here we also see that it is actually Tony who is being selfish, but as usual, he manipulates the situation to make Sal look like the selfish one instead.
I wasn't sleeping. I was resting my hips.
In the following scene, we see Janice arguing with Tony. Janice barges in on Tony while he is reading, and she asks why the meat she ordered was not ready for her. Tony responds by saying that she has to pay for the food she orders. Janice accuses Tony of being extremely harsh on her and Bobby simply because they are together. We see here how Janice also tries to reflect her own shortcomings onto Tony rather than assuming responsibility for herself. For example, we all know Janice could get a job to get some extra income, but instead she chooses to put the blame on Tony. During their conversation, Janice adds that she feels Tony blames her and Bobby for not being at Uncle Junior's house the night he was shot. Tony tells Janice that he does not blame them and that he only blames himself for what happened that night. Janice then tells Tony that a man Bobby's age should be a capo by now. We see Janice's true motivation in this scene is not Bobby or his well-being, nor Tony. She also does not care who Tony blames for what happened to him, but instead her only true concern is that she wants Bobby to make more money because in turn this would mean that she would have more money to spend. Later on, Tony meets up with Dr. Melfi and they discuss Tony's marriage. Tony admits that he likes Carmela having side projects, but regardless of how much he supports her, she seems emotionally distant. Tony then asks Melfi for guidance on understanding why he feels good making life harder on Janice and Bobby. Melfi says that Tony and Janice have never gotten along. Tony pushes back on Melfi by saying that that's not true and that it all started when he was a child. Tony remembers when their parents left Janice in charge of the house, leaving Tony and Barbara under her surveillance. Janice used this opportunity to tape record Tony and his sister as they were in the middle of having a massive fight. Tony goes on to explain that Janice then ended up using the recording as a way of extorting him by threatening to show their parents unless he performed menial tasks for her as she commanded. The following day, Tony meets up with Dr. Melfi again, and they dive deeper into where his hatred of Janice stems from. Dr. Melfi pushes Tony to dig deeper into his past as a way of uncovering where these feelings of resentment toward Janice stem from. Tony ends up admitting that early on, Janice received a lot of attention from the boys in the neighborhood, and she left early on in her life after falling out with her mother. Tony explains that because Janice left so early, it left Tony and his sister Barbara to take on all the abuse from their mother Livia. Melfi then asks Tony what would have happened if he would have been the one who left. Here, Melfi tries to help Tony place himself in his sister's shoes, trying to allow Tony to see how Janice was also abused and had no other choice but to leave. Tony responds that he would have never left because he always did as he was told. This obedience toward his parents is what eventually landed Tony in the life of crime. Tony also hates the fact that once Janice lived out her youth in the streets, she came back to the family when her mother's home was being sold in order to take her cut of the money.
Well, let me tell you, she gets nothing, because I got the scars.
Remember, I am summarizing this entire series as well as other popular works of literature, movies, and TV shows as well. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next episode or series. Let me know what you'd like me to summarize in the comments section below. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter for additional content, visit our merch store, and support us on Patreon if you can. Doing this helps my channel out tremendously. I thank you for your support.
You describe her as built.
In this scene, the viewer gets a deeper look into Tony's psyche. We see that Tony hates that Janice was able to escape the life he inherited by simply choosing to leave. In the end, Tony tells Melfi that Janice feels like she is entitled to a cut of what he has built up for himself, and that because he has the physical and emotional scars of growing up under Livia, he is the one who is truly entitled to the monetary gains of their family business. Essentially, Tony envies that Janice chose to live her life on her own own terms. Unlike him, Tony feels like Janice left him to be abused by their mother when he needed her the most. We see firsthand how Tony was deeply impacted by Janice early on. Essentially, through Janice, Tony learned his first lesson, not to love or trust anyone, even family, and how this experience helped him become the ruthless criminal he is. As we catch up with Vito, we see Jim finds out that he isn't really a sports writer after all. But Vito confesses to him that he isn't a writer and he is really from New Jersey. Vito tells Jim that no one can know who he truly is or where he lives. Later on, when Jim has to put out a fire, Vito decides to become a firefighter himself. Jim and his crew of firefighters head to a bar and they begin celebrating a job well done. We see when Vito tells the other firefighters that he would like to become one of them, Jim is not convinced and reminds Vito that becoming a firefighter requires commitment and loyalty, something he sees Vito is unable to provide him. In a later scene, Jim admits that he does not want Vito working as a firefighter simply because it could lead him to being hurt and he wouldn't want to see him get hurt. Once Vito starts working a 9-to-5 shift to provide for himself, he begins to struggle now that he actually has to work. Vito is so lazy and hard work is so foreign to him that he ends up leaving New Hampshire altogether. He sneaks out of Jim's home early one morning. On the road, we see Vito is drinking and driving. As Vito is heading down the road, he ends up driving into a parked car. The driver of the car has parked along the road to pick up his mail. When Vito approaches the owner of the vehicle, the man insists on calling the police to file a police report, even though Vito just wants to pay the man in cash for the damage he did to his car. We know Vito is on the run and he cannot allow the man to call the police because it could potentially alert his family, the New Jersey and New York crews of his location. Vito tries to convince the man to let him leave, but the man insists on calling the cops, and so Vito ends up taking the man out and driving away. As we catch up with Bobby, we see he goes to make a scheduled collection in Newark and ends up getting robbed and beaten badly. When Tony visits Bobby, he notices his own son is now falling behind academically. Tony sees just how being around Janice has negatively affected Bobby and his own children. Early on in the episode, we see how Johnny Sack is struggling financially now that the FBI have uncovered his finances. He ends up asking Tony to help him liquidate an operation he has set up in New Orleans. Tony ends up seeing Johnny's need as an opportunity for him to do something nice for Janice for once. Eventually, Johnny is backed into a corner and Sack agrees to admit to there being such a thing as the Mafia. By doing this, he is able to strike a deal with the prosecutor and he is sentenced to 15 years in jail. We see almost immediately how the other made men are vehemently upset at this. They are mad because by Johnny admitting to there being a mafia, any surveillance footage captured where he is associating with anyone is evidence of there being a criminal enterprise. Johnny confessing to there being an ongoing illegal enterprise puts everyone else he ever associated with at risk of being investigated under the grounds of them being a possible associate. As a result of all this and Johnny Sack needing the money, Tony ends up helping Johnny to cash out of the business operation in New Orleans. He tells him that he wants less money up front from the total cash out amount from the New Orleans business in exchange for Johnny's house at a discounted price. Tony then ends up taking the house and gifting it to Janice. In the final scene, Janice approaches Tony in his basement while he is stocking his wine on his wine rack. Janice begins to cry tears of joy as she thanks Tony for giving her a mansion to live in. In the end, we see Dr. Melfi was able to help Tony realize that the hatred he carried all these years for his own sister was itself rooted in feelings of jealousy and resentment. Tony was jealous that Janice was able to rebel and escape the toxic Soprano household at an early age by choosing her own path. Also, Tony resented for all these years how Janice left him alone with Barbara to take on the full wrath and abuse of their mother Livia, knowing full well the kind of mother she was.
Johnny Sack pleaded guilty. He got 15 years.
That was episode number 75, titled Mo and Joe. To watch the next or previous episode summary, click on the link in the description or at the end of this video. In the description, you will also find additional links for supporting our channel. I'll see you on the next episode. We upload new videos every week, so subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the like button as well. Click the notification bell to be notified of when we upload these videos. See you on the next episode of Culture Screen.